So I've been asked to make a brief opening statement, which for us is a closing statement. We've spent the last 4 days together in Kiev, carrying out this endeavor, which was called Thinking, Ukraine Thinking Together, Myslite z Ukrainою. This is something that we have done together in the sense that it involved Americans of various backgrounds, Canadians of various backgrounds, Russians of various backgrounds, different sorts of East and West Europeans, as well as Ukrainians. And of course, it involved Ukrainians of different places, different backgrounds, different generations. Our friends and colleagues, not only from Kiev and from the West, but our friends and colleagues from Crimea, from Odessa, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv. What we all came together to do was to think. We came together in the conviction that precisely when moments are difficult, we need to be able to think and to think together. We came together because we believe that there are classic questions of politics, of ethics, and of culture, which are both traditional and universal, and the posing of which can create a way for us to engage with each other, to learn from one another, and to express solidarity with one another. Of course, we came here in part because we all shared the conviction, regardless of where we were coming from, whether that was California or Moscow, whether that was Brussels or Berlin, that Kiev was and should be and will be a center, not just of political, but of intellectual life, and that we believe that we're helping to make Kiev a place where things like this will happen in the future. We came here, of course, also to express solidarity with our Ukrainian friends and colleagues, but we've been touched by the ways in which they have expressed solidarity with us. We have been touched and impressed not only by the way that Ukrainians took part as equals and very often as our superiors in our discussions of human rights, of Europe, of culture after the Maidan, of geopolitics, of totalitarianism, and of history and memory. We've been touched by the ways that they usually know more about us than we know about them. We've been touched by the ways that they understand our shortcomings and are willing to try to compensate for them. And of course, we've been touched by the ways that Ukrainians have engaged with this project and supported it and made something, I think, truly extraordinary happen here. Thank you.
As I'm local, I will switch to Ukrainian. Я насамперед хотіла подякувати Тімоті Снайдеру за декілька речей. Я думаю, що він дуже багато протягом цієї конференції дякував сам і несправедливо мало отримував подяк. Перша подяка – це дуже персональна. Я, як виконавчий редактор «Критики», напевно, ніколи не бачила стількох наших авторів одночасно в одному приміщенні. І я мушу визнати, що дуже багатьох я вперше побачила як людей. Я знала їх лише віртуально. Тобто це така персональна, дуже важлива зустріч. А друга річ, про яку ми вчора вже говорили з Тімом ввечері, я вирішила, що, напевно, треба її повторити, особливо в цих стінах. Дуже багато протягом останніх місяців кажуть про те, що проти нас ведеться і велася інформаційна кампанія, інформаційна війна. І я думаю, що ми всі чудово усвідомлюємо, що вона почалася дуже давно і що величезні ресурси були вкладені. Тобто це і лобісти, це і армія в так званих тролів, це і долари Газпрома, котрими корумпували дуже багатьох впливових людей на Заході, зокрема ми про Захід говоримо. І коли почався Майдан, в нас тут у грудні, якщо ви пам'ятаєте, ми не насолоджувалися такою увагою медіа, як ми насолоджуємося зараз. Тімоті Снайдер в ті дні, якщо, наскільки я могла відстежувати, видавав просто постійний потік і своїх інтерв'ю, якихось колонок, якихось статей. І я можу сказати, що він був одним з небагатьох Але дуже важливим нашим ресурсом, і врешті-решт оцей ресурс переміг і ці мільйони доларів, і цих лобістів, і цю армію тролів. Так що велика подяка Тімоті Снайдеру за те, що він робив від грудня, і за те, що він зробив протягом останніх кількох днів. Дякую.
Дякую дуже.
Thank you. The first impulse in coming here, I confess, was emotional. It was really a very strongly felt need to come and show support and solidarity, and to show our friends here in the Maidan and in Kiev and throughout Ukraine that despite the isolation and the fear and the anxiety that they may be feeling, that they are not alone or abandoned, that they have friends, serious friends, intelligent friends, friends who are prepared to understand them as best we can and to articulate what we believe they stand for, where we are, and to make their case. It is clear that the Maidan is one of the primary sites in the history of democracy, period. It is one of the most, I mean, when the history of democracy comes to be written, what happened there in that place will be one of the sacred sites, and I say sacred in inverted commas because it's a secular sacred site. It's not a religious ideal, even though religious people are free to benefit from it. I came away from the conference moved by the diversity of opinion and by the fortitude of the participants, and I'll share only two impressions that I had now. The first one was, before I came here, when I was back in Washington, D.C., reading very, very much about what you were doing here, one had the impression that democracy and pluralism in Kiev and in the Ukraine, but in Kiev especially, was a project, was a hypothesis, was an experiment, was a dream. Then I came to Kiev and I saw that it's not at all a dream, it's a reality. It already exists. And what you are defending against Putin is not the possibility of fulfilling a dream, but the fulfillment of a dream that has already occurred. It is perfectly clear as I walk through the streets and talk to the people here. Second thing I wanted to say is I've been paying more and more attention to, I guess, what we must call the language question, and it was obvious to me from afar that it's pure political demagoguery to suggest anything other than that Kiev and Ukraine is a naturally multilinguistic, multicultural, multi-ethnic society, and that these languages all go together. But being here, what's become, it's strange. We made a point at our conference of doing it in many languages precisely to make the point about diversity and pluralism and tolerance. But as I've been listening to all the things that I've been hearing at our conference in multiple languages and outside our conference in various places in Kiev that I've been going, in a funny sort of way, one of the things that the plurality of languages does is it actually makes the specificity of the language less important. In other words, I have heard beautiful pro-Ukrainian sentiments expressed in Russian, and I have heard a few very ugly anti-Ukrainian sentiments expressed in Ukrainian. And the more I think about the language question and the more I listen to what we heard, the conclusion I come to is that finally what matters is not what language you speak, but what you're saying in any language. And there is no language in which the ideals of democracy cannot be expressed. There is no such language. And similarly, there is no such language in which the opposition to democracy cannot be expressed. And finally, what will matter, as I say, is not who is speaking what, but who is saying what and to whom. And when the day comes that you actually do become a full-fledged member, well, hopefully of NATO, but of the EU, when you are actually a fully recognized European country, I will tell you that based on what I've seen here in Kiev, I could name a few Western European countries who, in the matter of tolerance and pluralism, could learn some lessons from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I came to this conference because I'm convinced that Kiev is the place to be in order to understand what is going on in Europe. I came to Kiev where I was first time more than 40 years ago. I came to this conference because it was a unique chance to get to know people from this area having experiences we could not have far away in Berlin. And I will go back to Berlin with all these experiences I got from the panels, from the briefings, from the conversations on the floors, and I think I will better do now in the public sphere in Germany to defend the Ukrainian, the ukrainské dělo. I'm sorry. I was impressed by the atmosphere of openness all these 3 days, and that we really had a chance to get an idea what is democratic Ukraine is like. And it is a unique place, and I have the conviction even that Kiev could become the third place in Europe, where people coming from Russia meet with people coming from other countries in the West and continue the encounter which has started by this great initiative, the initiative by Tim Snyder and Leon Wieseltier. I think we will have a long battle. It's not just 1 day, 1 week. It's a battle which is going on. I mean, we are in a country under attack on the borders. We are in a country which is which should be fragmented by forces from outside, and there will go on a battle in the capitals in other countries of Europe and in North America, and I think it will be very decisive. And I could not imagine 2 or 3 years ago that it will be a real battle and clash in the public opinion, for instance, in my country, in Germany, where I come from. But the chances to win these battles are good. I'm convinced, and I have the feeling that that your struggle here will get support not only from states and state leaderships, but from people. And we have, the intellectuals have to discuss what means we have to and how to support your struggle. Last but not least, I will take back the message to Germany that Ukraine is a country of unbelievable beauty. It's a kind of Europe, European microcosm, and it has so many features. It is large, but at the same time, in comparison to Russia, it is small. It is a vast country, and you have mountains, you have the steppe, you have the Black Sea, you have history, you have a culture of 1,000 years. And I think our work will be to remap Europe and to bring back, for instance, one of the oldest and biggest metropolises of Europe into the mental map of the Europeans. And I thank very much for this possibility that I could come to Kiev, and I promise you to come back.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have questions to our speakers. Yeah, sure.
My name is Miroslava Petzak. Can I ask Professor Timothy Snyder about the upcoming elections? Is this clash between what's at stake at these elections? What's at stake for Ukraine, and is this a battle between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians?
Let me start with the second half of the difference between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. No, of course not. I mean, these elections are not about ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians any more than American elections are about and Hispanics and people of English origin. ethnic identities play a certain general sociological role, but every individual is voting herself. Every individual is individually and votes. And we, all of us who know the voting patterns of Ukraine, know that there are political differences, know that there are tendencies. Just like my state, Connecticut, generally goes one way in American elections, Zaporizhzhia generally goes one way in Ukrainian elections. But not everybody in Zaporizhzhia votes the same way. And the language that people speak at home, or that they speak in public, does not determine what they do. And their ethnicity also does not determine what they do. The beautiful thing about democratic elections is that each person can vote for Tymoshenko or Poroshenko or Tihipko for whatever reason he or she wants in the privacy of the voting booth. Which brings me to your second question of what's at stake. What's at stake now in Ukraine with the elections is something which has been at stake in other places before. The possibility of free elections is one of the many things that we in the West take for granted. And during the last elections in the country where I live now, Austria, there was a serious debate in newspapers about whether it was worthwhile to vote, which I found terrifying, because for the previous, in Austria, for the previous 200 years, the ability to vote had been almost constantly in question. And in Austria, as across all the West, the right of all adults to vote is a relatively recent thing. And it's a struggle. In my own country, in the decade when I was born, people were literally fighting and sometimes dying in order to be able to vote. So the right to vote is something that has to be won. It has to be won sometimes by minorities, it has to be won sometimes by women, and sometimes it has to be won by countries that are in struggles with other countries. So what's at stake in these elections is quite a lot. At the level of concepts, we have a country, Ukraine, where elections are generally meaningful, that neighbors a country, Russia, where elections are a kind of theater. We have a clash between a place where votes count and a place where voting is a kind of ritual. That's a very substantial difference. And so these elections must happen so that the idea of election as a personal act, as opposed to some kind of scripted theater, can continue. These elections are important because given all that has happened in the last year, the Maidan, opposition to the Maidan, the change of government, people from all parts of Ukraine, whether it's Lviv or whether it's Dnipropetrovsk, whether it's Poltava or whether it's Odessa, all should have the right to give their opinions about what the next government should be like, which is why I think after the presidential elections, there should probably be parliamentary elections in the fall. Not because it's legally required, but because it's politically, I think, a good idea. So because these elections are so important, because elections are something that have to be fought for, because democracy is a kind of action, it's not something you can take for granted, what we are observing or what we are going to observe are acts of real courage. Not so much in Lviv or Ternopil, where everyone's going to be able to vote if they want. Ivano-Frankivsk, there aren't going to be any problems. But as one moves into other districts, we're going to see courageous grandmothers who are voting. We're going to see courageous young people who are voting, even though there's resistance to voting. We're going to see the way that voting is an act of courage, an act of individual courage, as well as an act of individual choice. And it's going to be those people who exemplify for us all of the tradition of democracy, not as something that you just have and take, but as something which you make, and something for which sometimes you have to take a risk. I think what's coming on May 25th is an election in which participation is going to be very high across the country. I think an outcome is going to be clear, if not in the first round, after 2 rounds. But I also think what's coming is that we're going to see individuals behaving courageously because they, much better than I, understand what the stakes are.
Thank you.
German Radio, Sabine Adler. I do have a question about the discussion in Germany about fascism in Ukraine, on the Maidan and so on. It's overshadowed all the reception of the events in Ukraine. How, what would you suggest how to handle this discussion in Germany by politicians, by mass media? Question to you all.
First of all, thank you for this question, which is playing an important role in the German public sphere. What I could learn on this conference, but not only on this conference, is that this is, first of all, a propaganda lie of the Russian mass media. And the fascinating and unbelievable thing is that the propaganda is working. Everybody knows that in Maidan and in other meetings and movements, there are some segments who are radical and maybe have even nationalistic or fascist elements of ideology, but everybody knows part in this movement, observing, reporting since November, that this was not a fascist or nationalistic, but a democratic movement. Of course, a movement for national independence and for the decision, the free decision of a country and a nation to join the European Union. But the amazing thing in Germany really is that Russian propaganda works. And I think it's quite clear why. Because one of the main means to intimidate and to intimidate the public opinion and the political classes to say you have no right to criticize Russia because you are from Germany and you have organized the Second World War, the massacres, the Einsatzkommandos, etc. And this is very well orchestrated, and the best thing is to make a counter campaign with information, just to make information what is going on. And I mean that we have a lively discussion among the Ukrainian Jewish community, which was well representative and outspoken on this. This message should be brought back to the German audience, and they can learn that if there is open discussion, they can do it, they can have it in Kiev. And last, this is very strange that nobody or most people do not deal with the real fascist or the new forms of fascism which is going on. I mean, there are elements of völkisches Denken, of völkisch tribalistic thinking. There is the Ruski Mir idea, which is an unbelievable concept, which is saying that all Volksgenossen outside of the borders of the Russian Federation are belonging to the Russian sphere, which is a legitimation for intervention in every country. And I have to tell you that the Russian ambassador in Germany told 2 weeks ago that in Germany we have 4.5 million Russian-speaking people, which is true. Most Russian Germans emigrating. And what does it mean to have he was speaking about the Russian diaspora in Germany. I mean, in the context of Putin's language. But I think we are confronted with a new phenomenon, and we, especially intellectuals, have to try to cope and to come to terms with what is new in this, what is old and what is new. There is no return to Cold War. There is some new mixture of modern, postmodern, and postmodern elements, and we have to analyze in order to win a very hard information and a war of values or of ideas. Yeah.
I would just want to emphasize something that my friend just said. There are two levels at which you have to fight propaganda. The first one is at the level of factual truth. And that simply is, as you say, an informational question. And that's easily enough done. The really difficult problem is to fight the underlying causes that incline people to believe certain kinds of propaganda. In other words, what is it about, what are the assumptions about Germany, Germany's past, Russia, Germany's relation to Russia, Germany's willingness or unwillingness to get involved in conflict. What is it that makes a population hospitable to certain kinds of lies? And I think that when you fight at that level, you're really fighting a battle of ideas. And it goes, and you know, if you want to, and it's obvious if the authors of the charge that Ukrainians are fascists are themselves fascists, and that it's to disguise the fascist nature of the regime in Moscow, that the regime in Moscow would like people to think that there are fascists here. But the real challenge is not in fighting propaganda in Germany or anywhere else, but you gave the example of Germany. It doesn't require only an understanding of Russia, it requires an understanding of Germany. And it requires, the question is, why are people credulous? Why is it succeeding? What is it about this moment in Germany's conception of itself in world history, European history? Why is it successful? And that means going back to first principles. And that's a long struggle, and it's a primary struggle, and it's a struggle in which humble writers and scholars and intellectuals actually can play a part.
I want to try to push some of these points a bit further. The fascism on the Maidan is not a description of events. Fascism on the Maidan is a German moral crisis. There are two completely distinct stories here. One story is the history of a protest movement which was started by a young investigative journalist of Muslim Afghan origin, which was joined at first largely by students, older people, whose first two mortal victims were a Belarusian and an Armenian, a movement which included people from all parts of Ukrainian social life, including Jews, but also Muslims. The story of the violent suppression of that protest and a revolution. That is one story. The story of the German discussion has essentially no relationship. It's a distinct subject. There is a story of what is happening in Ukraine, where we now have a conservative liberal prime minister, where we have very conventional people running the government. There's that story. And then there's the story of what's happening in Germany. And what's happening in Germany is an intellectual and moral crisis, which requires a certain amount of reflection. And I want to try to sketch out what I think three dimensions of that crisis are, or three sources of it. One of them is the very powerful desire, I think, to do nothing. If there are fascists on the Maidan, then it's fine for Germany and it's fine for the European Union to do nothing, right? And the desire to do nothing is a very powerful desire. And of course, there's a certain amount of shame if one honestly looks, as a German or an American or a Canadian or anyone else, at the people who are actually willing to take risks and die for the very things which we take for granted every day. There's a certain amount of shame in looking at that. And it's easier to say, no, those people are not better than me, which in many respects are better than us. They're worse. We're going to find a label which allows us to dismiss them. And in Germany, that label is fascism. So fascism is a label which allows Germans to do nothing and allows them to dismiss the people who have done something. The second level of the crisis is colonial. That in the long and in many ways extremely impressive and indeed exemplary German discussion of the Second World War, this territory has been almost completely excluded. The Soviet Union is discussed, and it's confused with Russia, which is a big mistake, and the Jews are discussed. And as I say, this is exemplary. No one has done this as well as the Germans. But unfortunately, the campaign in the East was of such horrible scale that there are many parts of it, there are many things which are not in the German public discourse. And the most important of them is precisely Ukraine. Hitler's Lebensraum was above all Ukraine. This territory, according to Hitler, was populated by subhumans who were going to be mastered, who were going to work as slaves on collective farms, and who were going to feed the superior race. Along the way, tens of millions of people from this part of the world were supposed to be starved to death. There was a colonial vision of Ukraine, which in fact not only led to the Second World War, but which caused some of the greatest suffering. This was the most dangerous place in the Second World War, except for Belarus. And in the years in the 1930s and 1940s, this was the most dangerous place to be in the world. And the problem is that the way the German discussion goes, in general, people who were victims then become subjects. So the Jews are seen as victims, so they become subjects. The Russians are seen as victims, and then they become subjects. But the Ukrainians are not seen as victims. And so therefore, Ukrainians don't exist in German discourse. They don't exist, or if they do exist, they exist very much the way they existed in the 1930s. And this is terrifying to observe. It is terrifying to observe senior members of the SPD, former chancellors, discuss Ukraine as though it were not a real state, and to claim that Ukrainians as a people are not a people like others. That is terrifying to me. That is absolutely terrifying, because that is the continuation of precisely the colonial way of seeing the world, which Germany was supposed to have overcome. And that brings me to the third part of the crisis. The third part of the crisis is the imperial. As soon as you accept that Germany is to do nothing, as soon as you accept that Ukraine is not a real state and Ukrainians are not real people, then you have moved very close to this Russian geopolitical worldview, in which you say, as Helmut Schmidt has said, as Gerhard Schröder has said, that the Russians have legitimate interests, that Russia is not a country like other countries. It should be able to impose its will on its neighbors. And these things are said with the wise air of people who know the way the world works. And these things are terrifyingly destructive, because as soon as you accept that, you are in a world of geopolitics and power, as opposed to a world of European norms and law. You have rejected the entire German and European achievement of the last 70 years. Because if you accept that geopolitics is right for Russia, you're accepting that geopolitics is right for the world. And that is a completely different logic than the logic that has led Germany to the peace and prosperity that it enjoys today. And it is precisely the logic of the Russian project, which is to flatter Germany. You too are a great power. Wouldn't it be nice if your great men met with our great men? Isn't it simpler that way? Isn't it more interesting? Isn't it sexier somehow that way? You're a great power, we're a great power. Why do we not talk over, let's talk over the heads of these meaningless people between us. Let's engage this like real men. And of course, that's engaged the attention, unfortunately, of some men who would like to consider themselves real. And the result of this is that you're taking a big step towards a world without the European Union, which even considered selfishly, without all the values of the European Union, even considered selfishly as a disaster for Germany. The German power position in the world now is absolutely superb because of the European Union. If the European Union is weakened, which is exactly Russian policy, then Germany too will be weakened, not just morally and intellectually, but it will also be weakened politically and economically. It is shocking to me how many big steps have been taken in that direction just in the first few months of 2014. And that's why I say that there's a Ukrainian story, but there's a completely different story, and that is a story of a German crisis. And I think that the time has come for writers in Germany to thematize the story that way, because that is in fact what's happening. And those of us looking at Germany, those of us who follow these debates, those of us for whom German culture and the German language are important, and who know something about Eastern Europe, are following this, I have to say, with growing alarm.
Thank you. We have a question here, please.
A question from Norway. Very briefly, there are people who still claim that what happened in Ukraine was a coup d'état, and therefore everything, including the election, is still illegal because a democratically elected government has been overthrown. Could you briefly just answer that claim and explain why you believe it's wrong?
Look, there's no doubt that a revolution took place. I mean, and nations have to be allowed to have revolutions in their history. If there weren't a revolution, I wouldn't be talking to you with the accent that I have. If there weren't an English revolution, England wouldn't exist. If there weren't a French revolution, there wouldn't be France. If there hadn't been Polish uprisings in 1918, there wouldn't be Poland. If there hadn't been resistance to communism, the modern East European nations hadn't been formed. We cannot sit in Oslo or in Berkeley and tell people that we have already had our revolutions. We've already had our moments of dethroning our kings. We've already had our moments of transition, but you cannot have one. There can never be a moment of transition in your country. We can't say that. There are moments of revolution. So I'm not going to stand before you and claim that what happened on the Maidan, was the equivalent of local elections in Chicago, Illinois. Of course it wasn't. Of course it was different. You had a moment where what you're calling a democratically elected government had created a situation in which you or I would also have revolted had we been there. So a democratically elected president does not have the right to undermine the Constitution of his country, right? If Barack Obama decides that that all of the states are going to go away, or that my parliament or the United States Congress no longer has any significance, or that he personally is going to appoint the Supreme Court justice, these actions are constitutionally illegitimate, even if Barack Obama is elected president. We have the equivalent of that in Ukraine, and much more. The legislation of January, which has largely been forgotten, brought about essentially a dictatorship in this country. And you can say it's a legal dictatorship because in Parliament, some people raised their hands and passed these laws, but the procedure was a little illegitimate, and the laws themselves, which basically banned free speech, banned free expression, banned the right to assembly, banned the right to form organizations. These are all things that, God help me, if they happened in Norway, I certainly hope that you would react to them. I'm sorry, was it Denmark? Okay, thank you. If they happen in Norway, I hope you would resist them, because if not, Norway's doomed, right? These are the kinds of things, these are make or break questions, these are live or die questions. If you can't say, write, gather, form organizations, then you don't exist as a society, right? So these are things that happened in January. These are things which delegitimated a president. These are things which generated, as an observable question, mass public resistance to this president, all of which transpired before the mass murder which was carried out by the previous government, the mass murder which led to the overthrowing of this president. So there is a story about the delegitimation of a previous president, and of course there's also a very boring story about the legitimation of the current government. This government is based upon the Constitution of 2004, which by a broad political consensus was the right place to go back to in the constitutional history of this country after the creation of a super presidential system. This government was elected by a large majority by a parliament which itself was democratically elected in the last democratic election. So after the president discredited himself and fled his own country, the organ which was democratically elected chose his successor. That successor, to its great credit, then immediately called presidential elections. Now, if this were some kind of fascist junta or some of these utter nonsense, these tropes that come from Russian propaganda, which we all then feel like we have to repeat, would it be calling presidential elections? When was the last time a fascist junta, like its first act was to call presidential elections? So the presidential elections are meant to further legitimate the order which has been created. So just to summarize, it would be foolish to deny that something extraordinary has happened, something unusual has happened. I think the word revolution is the right word, but it would be equally foolish to deny that there were reasons for this, that the previous order had itself broken the law, broken the constitution, delegitimated itself. And it would also be foolish not to notice that this government has behaved in an extraordinarily conservative and orderly way, and has offered to carry out elections as essentially its first action. So again, I mean, it's very important, I think, for us to pull, and I know that you asked the question for this reason, but it's very important for us to pull out of our minds these tropes that make it so easy to discard what's actually happening, right? These moronic tropes, fascists on the Maidan, fascist junta in power, these things bear no relationship to reality. All they do is prevent us from telling the story. And as you know, as a journalist, it's an incredibly interesting story, and it's one that deserves to be told in the details. Okay, thanks.
We have a question here. It's going to be in Russian, so if you want to put on headset.
Здравствуйте. Я приехал из Луганска. Я никогда не думал, что мой маленький город будет в центре мировых. Я могу вам сказать честно и откровенно, то, что происходит сейчас на востоке Украины, в частности, в Донецкой и Луганской области, называется простым словом гуманитарная катастрофа. Я, к сожалению, слышу, когда вам задают вопросы о был ли фашизм на Майдане, я вам могу сказать, сейчас на востоке Украины есть православный фашизм, и православный фашизм пришел вместе с русским миром и поднял самые негативные черты, которые присущи у людей. Это и разбои, грабежи, преступления, все это вооруженные преступления. Но я не об этом. Это, собственно говоря, у меня не вопрос, а у меня, собственно говоря, такая ремарка. Я бы очень хотел, пускай через год, пускай через 2, пройдет такой форум интеллектуалов где-нибудь в Донецке. Украина пережила гражданское противостояние, которое переросло в гражданскую войну, и как Украине удалось остаться единым государством, и как Украине жить дальше в составе Европы. Я бы очень хотел, чтобы такой форум произошел на востоке Украины через год, через 2, когда будет мир, когда будет согласие, когда будет единая наша страна. Спасибо.
Thank you.
We accept the invitation.
Maybe
What's the invitation?
maybe some remarks.
Yeah, okay, so 3, I'm not sure if I can satisfy you with my answer. Let me just make three remarks. The first is, I'm glad you mentioned Ruski Mir, because Ruski Mir is a devastating idea. Ruski Mir, as you said very eloquently, Ruski Mir reduces all of us, citizens of countries, into members of ethnicities. And as members of ethnicities, we are no longer full human beings. We are simply the puppets of someone else's foreign policy. So, you know, if you speak Russian or I speak Russian, then all of a sudden we're no longer human beings. We're no longer individuals. We are people who are the objects of someone else's policy. And as Karl Schlögel pointed out, this has happened before. The idea of Ruski Mir is the same idea as the Volksgenosse, that there is a community beyond the borders of a country whose identity and whose needs are to be defined somewhere else and who are to be rescued, right? But what is meant as rescue is actually conquest. So Ruski Mir is a horrifying idea. I completely agree. As to the nature of what's happening in the East, I would like Karl Schlögel to answer that part. I just want to say about the invitation. I had this in Kiev because Kiev is the capital of the country, and because most of my friends, not Karl, but most of my friends and colleagues from abroad, they have never been to Eastern Europe at all. They've never been to Ukraine at all. For them, Kiev was already the adventure, right? I mean, that seems silly to you from Luhansk, I know, but for them, Kiev was already the adventure. Personally, I was aiming for Dnipropetrovsk, but I was stopped. I was thinking seriously of Kharkiv, but wiser heads said, no, put it in Kiev. But I just finished our gathering, and what I said at the very end was, I hope the next time we do it in Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, and I would certainly be very happy if next time we could do it in Luhansk or in Donetsk. Okay, but now I want to ask Karl to talk about the condition.
Да, несколько слов. Да, я очень хотел бы, если наша конференция состояла бы там, в Луганске или в Донецке или в Мариуполе, чтобы быть еще ближе к тому, что происходит в Украине и что происходит в Европе. Я был там месяц назад, до Пасхи, в Харькове, в Краматорске, в Славянске, в Донецке. Я хочу вам сказать, что меня поразило, как дисциплинированно и как спокойно городское население продолжало свою очередную жизнь. Они ходили на работу, ходили в университет, и все эти сумасшедшие террористы, они там в своих зданиях. И если у меня была надежда, что гражданская война не будет, это основано особенно на том, как городское общество реагировало на это. Но я точно знаю, что сейчас уже совсем другая ситуация. Я не представляю сам, как люди через неделю в воскресенье ходят на выборы, на станции, где они отдают свои бюллетени. Я не знаю. И мне кажется, что это действительно очень требует большое мужества. И я очень надеюсь, что есть какой-то опыт, как люди сами себя могут защищать против нажима и против агрессии этих людей. Но откровенно вам скажу, я не опытный, у меня недостаточно опыта, чтобы вам рекомендовать, как относиться к этому. Это очень жаль, мне стыдно. И я был бы очень счастлив, если на такой конференции, как наша, мы тоже могли бы обсуждать такие вопросы. Но мне было важно, там присутствовали люди из Луганска, Харькова, Донецка, и они нам рассказывали об условиях, и это мы понимаем. И это важно объяснить это нашим людям там далеко. Да. Последнее. Я даже не знаю, как обозреватели ОЦД, как они выступают, как это будет. Но я очень надеюсь, что присутствие членов этой комиссии, которые будут на местах, что они создают какой-то ширм, какой-то защиту для населения, которое решается участвовать в выборах. Не будет. Выборов не будет, вы думаете? В Луганске и в Донецке. Да, но все-таки я думаю, что выборы просто чистая организация и логистика. Если государство Украины способно организовать выборы по всей стране, это доказательство, что эта страна сильная страна и что она в состоянии защищать.
Секунду.
Мы очень надеемся, что это выборы будут в других областях Украины. И очень надеемся, что эти выборы будут в один тур. Для чего? Чтобы у нас, дома у меня, чтобы не стреляли.
We sincerely hope that too. If I may, just one final question, because we are truly grateful for you, if you're bringing the conference to Kyiv and organizing it here. It has certainly made Ukraine probably more unknown to the world of intellectuals who maybe have not visited it before, have not covered the events here. The question is, based on all of the discussions that took place, what would be your kind of final call for the intellectuals in Russia? Because all of you are leaders of the opinion, and some of them there do provide the backing for the current regime. Some of them have participated, most probably did not participate in this particular conference and the discussion. You've talked a lot about the situation with the intellectuals in Germany at different levels, at the some of the traps like imperial and colonial and others. But what are the traps that Russian intellectuals would have to avoid or would have to try to overcome maybe in order to participate in that discussion? Just as a note that it's not only in Germany. Last week, The Guardian has organized a debate which was called Ukraine Crisis and a discussion, and the former ambassador of United Kingdom to Russia had said that small nations simply have to understand they have to be sacrificed sometimes in the dialogue between the bigger partners. So we have a lot of issues to deal with. Just maybe some of your comments and kind of calls for the Russian intellectuals. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel ashamed about this, but also what Tim quoted from our former Chancellor of the Federal Republic, that he believes that it is a Western illusion that there is no Ukrainian people. Literally, he said. But this is his view, and it will not. It is a dangerous view and frightening view, but this is not the last word. Yes, I think we have to concentrate analytically and criticizing this new Putinism, yeah? But at the same time, we have to learn that the Putins come and go, but Russia somehow will remain. And that means that we have to work with the thinking and reflecting parts of the Russian society which exist, and if you look not only the state channels, but go to Nezavisimaya Gazeta or to Novaya Gazeta or to Dozhd TV channel, you can see that there are minds open, free, independent, and taking risk. I have the feeling that in a certain way we have to return in a certain way to the dissident experience of the 70s and 80s, and I was in that time in the late Soviet Union, and we have to take up again the burden of working together under very, very unfriendly conditions. But we have to construct or reconstruct these discourse across the borders, but the conditions are not are quite complicated. But we should not forget that there is Russia, a great country, a big country with people who are able to think what is going on and who will think more about the chances of modernizing the country than to have a little successful war on the Crimea.
So thank you for the question. It reminded me of a couple of things I wanted to say. Whether we're talking about Germans or whether we're talking about the British or whether we're talking about Americans. There are some astonishingly foolish American writers on these questions too. One thing is striking. People who actually come to Ukraine, whether as writers or students or electoral observers or as football fans, generally have very different views than people who don't. Because people who don't are exposed to only a media which is undergoing an information war of unprecedented sophistication. And I think the simplest way, and perhaps the only way for this to be undone, is for people to come, which was one of the very simple motivations for having this conference in Kiev, just to show that, it's going to sound very stupid, and I'm sorry to you, but just to show that Ukraine is a real country, and Kiev is a real city, and there are Ukrainians with whom you can talk, and Ukrainians who can organize such a thing, and it can be not only interesting but also beautiful, as I think it was. I mean, one of our very elemental purposes was to show this Western world, which is so infected by these terrible ideas, that there is nevertheless a base reality here. There are real people like my friend Konstantin. There are very real people with whom you can talk, and from whom you can learn, and who have experiences that are perhaps even more interesting and more relevant than yours. It's a very simple thing, but that's one of the basic reasons why we had this in Kiev. And so this is an original idea. It's an idea which emerged in the conference, but there should be a Kiev test or a Ukraine test for Western writers and intellectuals. Did you write about Ukraine in 2014? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, did you go to Ukraine in 2014? Because that is the most fundamental divide. I mean, I just gave a long discourse, and I'm sorry about the horrible Germans, but of course some of the people I feel closest to right now, the people who, even though I'm exhausted late at night, I write emails to, are the German journalists who are out in Sloviansk or Donetsk, the German journalists who are actually here in large numbers, and they understand things. They're doing a good job. So it doesn't have anything to do with nationality, but it has a lot to do with experience. And so it's very important that we all find ways for people to come to Kiev, to come to Ukraine, one way or another. And then about the Russians. This was not meant to be the wise Westerners coming to Ukraine to teach the lessons of capitalism and democracy. That pose is ridiculous. You know, the United States has done enough, foolish things since 1989 or 1991 that we can instead have a conversation about our mistakes and your mistakes. And it wasn't meant to be a Western-Eastern encounter. It was meant to be an international encounter. So actually, the largest national delegation, if you want to think of it this way, was from the Russian Federation. We had more people here from Russia than from any other European country. And that was on the logic that the Russian-Ukrainian conversation is an important one. Not to deny that conditions in Russia are special, but as Karl suggested, to confirm that no conversation about Ukraine makes sense without some Russians, and no conversation about Europe makes sense without some Russians. So we invited Russians, and from my perspective, a Russian who said yes was doing something far more just than a German or an American who said yes, because they know that when they stand in front of the cameras and talk to millions of people, that they're being noticed. They know that that's being registered. So I admire my Russian colleagues who came and took part in our first panel. And our first panel was, by the way, in the Russian language, and not just for convenience, but because we had lots of people who liked to speak Russian, not just the Russians, but because we wanted to make sure that the Russian Federation. Our panels were in English, French, German, Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And that's because, and this is the last thing, these problems that we're having in various ways are now all part of one syndrome. The problems that Russia is having are now also our problems in various ways. And so I agree completely with the premise of the question and with Karl's response. We can't do it without Russians. We have things to learn from Russians, and Europeans can't understand what's going on in their own countries without getting a view of it from Russia, because Russia very many times in history, very many times, has given us a sense of coming attractions. Very many times things happen in Russia ahead of when they happen in other places. And this may be one of those times. Certainly if Russian foreign policy succeeds, it is going to be one of those times. So from my point of view, it's all one big conversation, and therefore I was very appreciative of the Russian colleagues who came and took part. And I was particularly glad that we had our first panel about human rights, by the way, in the Russian language. I thought it was perhaps the most interesting. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We wish, you know, for this event to be regular. We cannot impose any timing, but of course, doing it regularly would be fantastic. And thank you so much again for being with us and coming to Ukraine and bringing such a great crowd here. So thank you very much.